Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to WatchBox, and thanks for logging on. We are starting our weekend off right, and as ever, everything you see here is for sale. Reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com for purchase and pricing, names, references, and when available, prices in the description below. We are also buying watches, one watch or a full collection, stocking up for the holidays, paying our top prices of the year. No upper limit on value paid. Likewise, reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com. All right, let's go big. Back in 2001, Vacheron Constantin launched the Moonwatch-powered Medicus Doctor's Chronograph. That was a 90-piece limited edition. In 2002, it went bigger with a platinum, full skeletonized, full engraved Moonwatch-powered Medicus chronograph. Nominally a doctor's chronograph with blackened hands and indices on a pulsation scale dial. The watch is an array of color, engraving, depth, textures, tones, and materials that simply stuns the eye, a feast for the senses. You can see the movement from the dial side, and you can see that it has been exquisitely decorated. Notice the mainspring barrel with the Maltese cross cut straight into its cap. The timepiece, of course, with blues, blacks, silvers, and reds on its dial side. Just as impressive when you turn it over. This is, in fact, based on the Le Mans 1872, which is the twin register version of the 1873 that forms the basis of the Moonwatch caliber. Manual wind, extraordinarily finished, and you can see not just mirrored anglage on every bridge, not just skeletonization, not just engraving, but all three in tandem with black polished screw heads that have chamfered slots as well as circumference. You can see the mirrored beveling on the edge of every steel component of the chronograph and the satin finishing across the tops. The timepiece is absolutely intoxicating. 38 millimeters wide by 43 millimeters lug to lug by only 11.5 millimeters thick. This is Vacheron at its absolute historic best, taking an Abauche from elsewhere and completely making that movement its own. The finish of this watch, the execution on a manual level, putting it amongst the very few Swiss watches each year that are truly handmade. An extraordinary landmark watch by Vacheron and one of the finest chronographs available. Now let's take a walk on the independent side, and the independent side with Moser is the wild side. If you remember the Pioneer Tour, then this watch is going to be familiar. This is the H. Moser & C Pioneer Center Second Funky Blue Fumé Black DLC, 42.8 millimeters in DLC black. You can actually see if we get close here that the watch includes a lovely contrast between satin finish and polish. It has the well-known Moser scalloped lugs, but with a coining inside. Screw-down crown, 120 meters water resistant. We'll grab my polishing cloth, and the timepiece has plenty of lume. It is a true sports watch. You can see there's a chaptering outboard with luminescent dots, blackened indices. The hands at center likewise blackened, but with high contrast. There's that fade from silver blue at center to navy, almost black at the edge. And inside, protected down to 120 meters, HMC 200 manufacturer movement. They make everything, including the escapement, the balance, and the hairspring. Free sprung with a full bridge for shock resistance. It uses a magic lever style bidirectional winding system to energize a 3-day power reserve. Let's throw this watch on the wrist, and you can see it is technically proficient and physically imposing. One of the larger options for Moser. Nevertheless, it's a nice shape to fit the wrist. As you can see, the lugs tilt down and around the wrist. Comfortable. You can see this down the barrel shot. I've got plenty of clearance on both sides, and in a flourish rarely seen on strap-worn sports watches, we have a full deployant clasp in matching DLC. The strap is beautifully perforated and wonderfully flexible. That's one take on a Moser dial. Let's take another look at Moser, but from a movement standpoint. This is the Endeavor Perpetual, a watch that at just over 40 millimeters represents a lovely solution to the age-old problem of perpetual calendars, namely their sensitivity to mistakes. Well, this watch with a perpetual calendar by Andreas Streller does away with that problem, as you have a bi-directional rotating perpetual calendar system, 12 months corresponding to 12 hours, and you can see how the watch is able to jump forward or backwards. The quickset works a little bit differently than the way the watch jumps when it's under its own power, so don't worry so much about that. Just note that the system is bi-directionally adjustable and very simple. Month and date on the dial, leap year phase indicator on the case back. The watch has a 7-day manual wind power reserve and an extraordinarily beautiful caliber HMC 341. As with the other movement we just saw, entirely executed in-house, you have jewels and chaton, black polished screws, double crested Cote de Genève, a 14-karat gold, low friction escapement, and overcoil hairspring, a big slow beating balance, 18,000. It does feature hacking seconds. It does feature bidirectional quickset. It does have a power reserve, and though rated to 7 days, in fact, it will run to almost 9 days at exhaustion. The case has incredible contouring with a lovely fluid bezel that's concave all the way around, but longer at the extremities and thinner in the middle, with mirrored concave hollows within the lugs, contrasting with vertical satin finish. Even the case back is sculpted. As you can see, the case back sapphire is designed to wrap around the wrist. A truly easy watch to wear on a small wrist because of its particular shape. It's secure, handsome, and a little bit avant-garde if you consider the complication, traditional if you consider the stance and the elegance, as it is a thin watch at only 11.3 millimeters thick. By the way, full deployant clasp, not a universal feature on Moser dress watches, so that is a nice one to have. That said, the Blue Lagoon puts them all to shame. Not because it's more complicated, but because it's less. All of the magic in this 100-piece limited edition, and you can see it is part of the Endeavor family, the Endeavor Blue Lagoon, absolutely gorgeous. A watch that features, yes, a Moser manufacture movement, but frankly, that's less the interest than the concept dial. When you hear about a concept dial at Moser, you are getting a dial that is pared down to the bare minimum, whereas the Purity dials, which are pared back from the conventional dials, feature fewer indices, less printing. The concept dials feature absolutely no printing whatsoever. 3 hands, and that's it. Not even signed Swiss made. You have that Lagoon blue at the center, and it fades to black at its edge, the famed fumé fade for which Moser is known, but you will note there's a metallic sunburst grain radiating out from the center. The case flanks are nicely scalloped, hollowed, and polished with vertical satin, and as you can see, Moser's conventional inverse conical crown with a sharp, easy-to-grip knurling. The timepiece with a 3-day automatic winding power reserve, technically identical to the Pioneer with the exception of water resistance, but sometimes less is more, and that's certainly the case with this dial. You will note it does feature stop seconds, and if you look very closely, you can see the seconds hand has been rolled to match the curvature of the underside of the sapphire. This one has a simple pin buckle, and as you will note, not a precious metal watch, stainless steel. This is Moser at its best. All right, jumping across Switzerland, from one end of Switzerland in Schaffhausen to another, Moser makes 1,500 watches a year, Rolex somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million. Nevertheless, these watches retain a certain mystique that is unique in the industry, and no Rolex is more exalted than the Cosmograph Daytona, the racer's watch. Now this, of course, launched in 2016, is the metallic sunburst green dial with full yellow gold, 116508. The watch is 40 millimeters with a double locking oyster clasp that features the 5 millimeter Easy Link quick adjustment system internally. It's 100 meters water resistant, has a 3-day automatic winding power reserve. It's a COSC chronometer, and with screw-down crowns and pushers, I actually suspect this watch is more than 100 meters, but Rolex is always conservative with its ratings, its claims, even its boasts. This is a timepiece that sits low on the wrist. 12.3 millimeters thick, it'll easily slide underneath the cuff. It's got a lot of personality. Green with red and white accents, yellow gold hands, indices, and crown. The dial is singular, and it's one of the reasons why this watch, though rarely seen, is often discussed online. It is a bit of a celebrity watch, a cult classic, rarely seen because of its price, I should mention. Full gold has its advantages when it comes to exclusivity, as the pitfall of most Rolex watches is that they are common. With this watch, you get Rolex quality, the aura and mystique of the Daytona, and exclusivity. It is the perfect combination. That said, there are those for whom steel will always be real, and Rolex will always mean the Submariner. Fortunately, I have this previous generation 116610 LN Lunette Noire, 40 millimeters with the first generation Submariner super case. It's 300 meters water resistant. It has that wonderful glide of the 120 click Rolex bezel. Let's have a listen. Rolex has had the bezel feel and sound nailed for at least 3 generations of Submariner. It is one of the best feeling and best sounding dive bezels. It also has a wonderful knurling that's sharp and easy to grip regardless. Line up the sapphire capped pearl with the minute hand. You have an impromptu 0 to 60 minute timer, and as you can see, the watch is thin for a diver at about 12.7 millimeters. You can absolutely wear this as your dress watch. Now, I showed you Glidelock on the Daytona. Things get a bit better on the Subs and the Sea Dwellers. Or rather, I should say I showed you Easy Link on the Daytona. I gave up my game. This is Glidelock right here on the Sub. Whereas the Daytona gives you 5 millimeters of in and out adjustment. Here you get 20 millimeters in 2 millimeter steps. So you can use this as a sizing tool, but you can also use it if you just want to make small adjustments as your wrist expands or contracts in hot or cold weather activity or inactivity. Chronometer certified, automatic winding, 300 meters, water resistant, 48-hour power reserve, hacking, and quick set with a black lacquer dial, white gold hands, and indices. There are those for whom value will always beat the name. The designer factor of Rolex means the name carries a premium. This Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter James Bond edition is a tribute both to the Ministry of Defense issued Omega Seamaster 300s of the 1960s as well as 007. Now you can see on the reverse side of this 42mm no-date titanium tribute watch a couple of elements that refer to the Ministry of Defense, like the series number of the watch or the Ministry of Defense tri-spoke or arrow, and then of course there's some elements such as 1962 reference to the first official Bond film, Dr. No, and 007, the agent himself, that are specific to the 007 edition. Now the watch, of course, 42mm in titanium with a matching mesh bracelet is a dramatic thing. I've seen several different versions of this watch, and on the Stabe manufactured titanium mesh bracelet, I have found my favorite variant. Now there's a lot of, we'll call it photina, but not in the conventional sense because it's pervasive. There's the entire dial, which has gone tropical or brown, likewise the bezel, and then you have that ecru coloration designed to evoke a tritium fade from the period. If you take a close look, you can also see on this dial, not only is there no date, but you have the Ministry of Defense tri-spoke once more, and lovely satin finished and blackened hands, an exceptional historical cue that's easy to miss at first glance. You'll also appreciate that here, the sapphire, and it is a sapphire, has a lovely cambered domed profile designed to create the same off-axis distortion of a vintage plexiglass. And you can see that straight bar junction between the bracelet and the lugs means it has a very 60s look to it. You'll also appreciate that the entire case, bezel, and dial all satin or matte, as even the bevels here, conventionally polished on the Seamaster 300 meter. Nope, here they are satinated. There is a lovely construction that allows this mesh bracelet to work like a conventional strap. So you have apertures, and then on the other side you have a full titanium deployant clasp. So it works like a strap even though it is a bracelet. Throw the watch on the wrist, I should mention it's still 300 meters water resistant with a 55-hour power reserve. It is an anti-magnetic, or perhaps we should say amagnetic, master chronometer. Feather light, 50 millimeters lug to lug with a very comfortable fit, feel, and ideal ergonomics for a small wrist. Even if your wrist is as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference, you're going to want to give this one a try. Let's do a quick Lume shot here with some of the sports watches that have just filed across your screen. We'll start with the Omega, and then we'll switch to the Moser. Here you can see the Omega, and one of the standout features of this edition, the fully lumed bezel. Note that the pearl in the bezel is green to more easily reference against the minute hand, which likewise is green, ideal for diving. You'll also appreciate the fact that here we have Rolex just below, chromolite blue. This is the signature proprietary lume color of Rolex. It's a diver, maybe not quite as spectacular as the Omega, but certainly competitive. If you want the best Lume shot, I think the Omega takes it on today's episode, but the others are not going down without a fight. Here is the Moser Pioneers. You can see a double index up at 12 o'clock to make it easier to discern in the dark. And then we have the Daytona. And to be perfectly fair with these other three watches, I did not immediately charge them up like I did with the Omega prior to the Lume shots. Here, I'll bring the Daytona back after charging it a little bit. You can see it's already brighter. All right, so let's talk about the last watch that I've got on the table here before we pull aside some other specials. This, of course, is the Zenith Shadow, the Zenith Chronomaster Shadow, a timepiece that references not so much the history of the El Primero as a prototype chronograph built in a small series. It was sort of a demonstrator rather than a strictly speaking piece-unique prototype, but there was a pre-El Primero chronograph all blacked out that had this aesthetic, and this watch is a tribute to that. It is not strictly speaking a limited edition so much as it is a tribute to that pilot production watch. This is an El Primero, make no mistake, as you can see through the case back, caliber 4061, which is a little bit unusual because that movement was developed to be one of the open dial variants. But as a no date, it is very pure. It is true to the original. It is clean, media blasted, blackened titanium, and as you can see, it is a backloader, as the bezel and the case have been hewn from a single component. They are basically monoblock, so the only component that removes is the case back, and then the dial and the movement load through the back. It's 37 millimeters feather light and under 48 millimeters lug to lug, which means it's a nice compact watch across the wrist. Automatic winding with a 50-hour power reserve. It has that characteristic super smooth sweep of the El Primero seconds hand as it continues to beat away at 36,000 vibrations per hour. Though the original prototype was a contemporary of the original El Primero caliber 3019, the prototype itself was a manual wind watch. So this watch is a little bit of a quirky tribute in that it is an El Primero with all that entails historically and technically, but it is an homage to a watch that preceded the Zenith El Primero series. Still gorgeous with a lovely domed sapphire. You can see the watch is feather light on my wrist, narrow across the wrist, easy to wear on a small wrist. I'd recommend it for a wrist as small as 13 centimeters circumference. And then it has a lovely strap, which as you can see has a contrasting binding stitch, rubber on the bottom, and a lovely textile pattern across the top, which I actually think is a synthetic, even though it has the suede feel of leather. I believe this is a hybrid of synthetic material and rubber. No doubts about this one. This is an exceptionally refined Audemars Piguet Royal Oak offshore. Some of these things are a little bit silly. The volcanoes, the bumblebees, one might even say some of the limited editions like the Survivors and the innumerable F1 driver editions dulled the senses in the late 2000s too much. This watch is just right. Stainless steel, 42 millimeters with a lush lacquered brown mega tapisserie dial. There's a contrast of silver, white, and blue. In the metallic blue that's used, you see a wonderful foil to the brown. Blue and brown, not often seen, but there's a subtle contrast here rather than the dramatic pop in contrasting the numerals from the brown base. Now it's 100 meters water resistant, and being a post-2014 offshore 42, it has a display case back so you can see the movement, and it is AP's own movement caliber 3126 with a 3840 Dubois de Praz vertical clutch chronograph module, full balance bridge with a Gyromax style free sprung balance for shock resistance, bidirectional winding, 22 karat gold rotor with the coats of arms of Audemars and Piguet families, reminding you that AP, founded 1875, is the oldest Swiss manufacturer, still controlled by the founding families. 50 to 55 hour power reserve. I mentioned 100 meters water resistant. It also features stop seconds and a quick set date. This watch, of course, is on a leather strap, so you're going to want to replace this with a diver style AP rubber strap before you go in the water. Just know the technology and the capability is there. The watch is big on the wrist. All offshores and Royal Oaks wear larger than their rated size. I encourage you to think of this more as a 44. That said, because it's not on the hornback alligator strap, it's on a regular scale. It's not quite as stiff. The hornback straps are very stiff. They fight your wrist if you're borderline for wearing the watch. I'd recommend this watch for a wrist of 14 centimeters circumference or larger, but again, you're going to want an oval wrist size to get the most out of this watch. One of the best refinements on the post-2014 42mm offshore is that the chronograph pushers themselves are made of scratch-resistant ceramic, and the shoulder for the crown likewise of ceramic. As you can see, this watch is in outstanding condition inside and out with sharp bevels, character lines, breaks between satin and polish. You can even see the small bevels of the shear guard structure on the crown side. Those are beautifully intact, and of course, this being an AP, all of that metalwork is hand finished. But let's up the ante, shall we? Speaking of hand finishing, nothing quite compares to a full engraved case, gun engraved, as the style would be. This is the Patek Philippe Retrograde Perpetual. It is the 5160. Launched in 2013, it was an evolution of 2007's 5159. It's 38 millimeters, though it looks larger, and as you can see, the watch, exquisite in white gold, has a warmth to it that platinum lacks. You can also appreciate the fact that no two of these are exactly alike, and the refinishing of the case by a conventional burin and hammer, entirely pervasive, as even the retaining screws for the bars that hold the lugs have been individually engraved. You can see that the crown has been engraved, the bezel, the case back, the dial likewise has received the same treatment, even the buckle, fully customized and hand engraved. If you want a handmade watch, this is one of the best ways to understand just how deeply invested the artisans were, as the timepiece has been entirely customized to go from a 5159G to the 5160. These are scarce. Now you have a retrograde perpetual calendar on the dial. Note that it features lovely blackened white gold hands as well as blackened white gold brigade style Arabic numerals, a special feature for a special Patek. Aperture style day, leap year phase, and month with a retrograding date. Again, all of this is 38 millimeters. It is not a huge watch. Pop the case back, which you will note is extraordinarily finished and customized, and you will find that even the frame of the movement sapphire has been engraved. Now, the movement is caliber 324. It's well known. It's guaranteed from the factory to run no worse than -3 + 2 seconds a day. It has an anti-magnetic silicone hairspring, 6-position adjusted with a free-sprung gyromax style balance, 35 to 45 hour power reserve. So if you wear the watch every day, it is essentially set it and forget it, as the perpetual calendar need not be adjusted until the year 2100, and the moon phase has an adjustment interval of 122 years. When I throw it on my wrist, it's broad. It's an officer-style watch, which means it's in the fashion of the early 20th century pocket watches that would have been converted to wrist format for convenience and ease of use during trench warfare, frequently worn on the wrists of officers. You needed both hands for the trenches, and you didn't have time to grab for your pocket. Thus, the officer's watch, a wristwatch conversion of a pocket watch, which is why we have a hunter case back here, which is why we have straight lugs that are welded directly to a case that's a little bit more bulbous and rounded than a typical wristwatch. It's why we have a hunter hinged case back and an onion-style crown. All of these are elements that would have been germane to those early officers' watches. Granted, this one is finished to a higher standard, but it is a nod to Patek's real history in the early 20th century. So let's talk about sports watches. Let's talk about something approaching the best. Back in 1953, two companies more or less invented simultaneously the first modern dive watch, but it was the Blancpain 50 Fathoms that made it to market months before the Rolex Submariner, and thus this is the heir to the original. Absolutely as good as it gets. 45 millimeters in steel, but it's only about 50.8 millimeters from lug to lug. So this is a watch that'll fit on a smaller wrist, including mine. As you can see, the fit is ideal. Across the wrist, I've got plenty of clearance on each side, such that I could still be wearing this watch if my wrist were 14 centimeters in circumference. Well, it's not a thin watch. It's also not a thick watch. You've got a fighting chance with a dress cuff, especially if you're a bigger dude and your cuff is larger. This is going to wear as a dress watch. A bit of an impressive presence, I will say, but all the same, it's not too thick and it's not too broad, so you've at least got a fighting chance. 300 meters water resistant, 5-day power reserve. It features a sapphire capped bezel, giving it a wonderful camber, the appearance of perpetually being wet or sitting underneath a dewdrop. And then the entire bezel can be lumed because of that sapphire cap, which makes this a very scratch resistant watch. Caliber 1315 inside is surrounded by an iron shield, which helps to channel magnetic field lines around the movement, improving its anti-magnetic resistance. Of course, it features a free-sprung balance adjusted in 6 positions, so it is as good as any chronometer, and I will say these watches in practice often run +1 seconds per day. So not only are they technically proficient, but they are very accurate and beautiful. As you can see, the watch features an enormous and deeply knurled crown, and a detail I happen to adore, the use of small hex screws and bars to retain the strap rather than spring bars, which can be somewhat variable and a risk on a large, heavy, and expensive watch. Sailcloth strap, nearly indestructible navy blue with rubber on the bottom so it won't aggress against the wrist. The movement is hand finished and beautiful, and while only your Blancpain watchmaker will know, that is the ultimate sign of integrity. Beautiful finish where it may not be seen. So let's do a Lume shot with this watch. Close Encounters, a circular supernova, a flying saucer. As you can see, and as you can hear, the bezel looks, sounds, and feels fantastic. Thanks to that sapphire cap, the entirety of the bezel can be lumed, making for an easy and ready reference. Now, can you guess? Well, let's see how you did. From the House of Journe, and still immaculately wrapped in protective plastic, we have the original version of the FP Journe Octa Sport. You can see that it's silver. That means this is the discontinued aluminum series, made for about 2.5 years. This is a timepiece that represented FP Journe's first foray into the sports watch world in late 2011. Now, the watch is 42 millimeters, and unlike the standard models, it has a unique case that you won't see on the FP Journe dress watches. It also has an integration of bracelet and case, and while this may seem elementary today, it was anything but intuitive back in 2011 before the full integrated bracelet sports watch craze of 2019 hit in full force. The watch, of course, is beautifully finished with rubber bumpers that have been vindicated by time, as very few of these watches show up without remarkably well-preserved rubber bumpers, and I should mention, few of them show up with any kind of marks, gashes, or disfiguring effects of abrasion or dents. So this is a watch that has held up remarkably well, in large part because of the rubber bumpers. While they can be a little bit polarizing, they are also discontinued, meaning that not only is this the discontinued aluminum version, not only is it on the highly desirable and optional bracelet, but the rubber bumpers now are an interesting look back on Journe the way it was as a brand in a time that is now bygone. And as we know, with watches that are discontinued and represent the minority of past production, we're going to find that this is a highly collectible piece. Today, they're rolling off the line without the bumpers, and a lot of people, as they do with the early brass movement Journes, are looking at the rarity of the early examples, even as the new ones, qualitatively perhaps, might be what the market wants at the time. Ask any Journe collector, do you prefer brass movements or gold movements? And I would say 9 out of 10 will say the brass movement for collectability, and that's the way we're going to be looking at the rubber bumpers. The dial is gray, and what you might not be able to tell at first glance is that the numerals themselves are solid blocks of luminova. They're not simply transferred paint. They actually have 3 dimensions, including height. So when you look at the watch in the dark, you do get that effect. There's a sapphire with red accents down at 6 o'clock for constant seconds, and as you can see, Journe's obligatory dial side bolts are used to fix that little bezel around the small seconds. The watch features a power reserve indicator, a red on silver double-digit date, grand dot, and then what you're looking at 9 o'clock is an AM/PM indicator for the time at center. What really sets these watches apart is that they have a movement that is composed of aluminum. Now, this is still the case today. The aluminum cases are discontinued, but the Octa 1300 made for the line Sport remains in aluminum. So you have an aluminum movement with a 5-day rated power reserve. Reality is about 160 hours, so they will run for almost 7 days. And it's adjusted in 5 positions, and FP Journe boasts that this is the closest an automatic movement will come to operating like a chronometer. He always said that is the ultimate challenge, to get an automatic movement to run like a chronometer in terms of isochronous behavior, consistency of timekeeping, and precision, and that's what he achieved with the Octa Sport. So a timepiece that is bygone tech and style, with all of the accuracy and watchmaking savoir-faire that you expect of the Journe brand. That said, I have a preference for latter-day avant-garde, and I have to say that the Bulgari Octo Finissimo family has really helped to put Bulgari on the map. Already a vaunted jewelry purveyor, Bulgari watches, however, seem to lag behind in reputation, and it's important to note that in 2000, when Bulgari bought Gerald Genta and Daniel Roth, it inherited the company's Valet du Jeu workshop that specialized in ultra-thin movements. And in 2017, we got the Octo Finissimo Automatic. It won the men's watch prize at the GPHG. In 2019, we got the version of the watch that wears best on a daily basis. Because as we know from Royal Oaks, Nautilus, Octo Finissimo, insert your favorite integrated bracelet steel sports watch, disfigurement of the finish is inevitable. Well, in black ceramic, not only do we have a watch that's hypoallergenic and feather light, but we have a material that can withstand the slings and arrows of life on the wrist, almost scratch-proof. It's second only to the sapphire crystal in hardness on this watch. So you can now wear this ultra-thin, beautifully faceted and finished 40 millimeter, 5.7 millimeter thick sports watch, and you don't have to worry about scratches. Technically, it's identical to the titanium version, and it's only a little bit thicker. It is half a millimeter thicker, and as you'll note, it still sits beneath my wrist hair. Easily cuffed, it's only 46.5 millimeters across the wrist and nominally 40 millimeters in diameter. I have to say it wears smaller than that. Contrast on the dial is high. There's no difficulty discerning the time, and then the movement, of course, is everything you expect from a company that builds ultra-thin minute repeaters. And you get that Gerald Gente Daniel Roth savoir-faire, a movement caliber BVL 138 with a 55 to 60 hour power reserve in spite of its thin profile. It's only 2.23 millimeters thick, but 36.6 millimeters in diameter. The mark of a true manufacturer building a movement suited to the size and shape of the case. Platinum, not gold, not tungsten micro rotor on ceramic bearings for efficiency. A full balance bridge to help add stiffness to the structure of this ultra-thin movement. And then you can see that it's actually quite well finished with real abrasive wheel Côte de Genève, not the stamped kind. You can also see there's engine turning on the base plate, satin on the wheels, as well as across the rotor, black polishing of the screws, and anglage that is a combination of machined and hand finished. So started with a machine, but then finished by hand. The finish that you get here is on par with what you would receive from Audemars Piguet and F. Vacheron, and that is high praise indeed. Now, we finish with two luminaries from Lange. Let's talk first about the Emma Lange because it came sequentially first back in 1999. 150 years since the birth of Emma Lange, this watch was made in 150 pieces in platinum. It is a traditionally sized men's dress complication. It is 35.9 millimeters. The moon phase disc on the dial has a correction interval of 1,058 years. You can see the constellation of the Big Dipper. You can also see Orion's belt, stars, as well as conventional cabochon-style white gold indices on this dial. We have white gold alpha hands, a lovely vaulted Alongo Unzono logo, and outboard there is a railroad track for reading the minutes. It is a gorgeous watch and immensely poetic. As you can see, it is also thin and wearable, so if you do have a smaller wrist or you have a taste for traditional size and discretion, this watch is that to a T. The movement, however, makes no compromises in finishing, as you have freehand engraving. You have jewels set in golden chaton fixed by fired blued screws, black polished swan's neck regulator, case clamp screws, location pegs, and the cover to the escape wheel, engine turning on the base plate, as you can see mirrored anglage on the edge of the bridges, and that wonderful nickel copper zinc alloy with the golden hue known as German silver with a 3/4 style bridge referencing the pocket watch era of East German watch fabrication. Throw it on the wrist, comfortable, nicely sized, slim, easily fits underneath the cuff. It needs nothing in terms of bulk. This is a timepiece that has big personality in a compact case. It is elegance, good taste. It is romance on the wrist. This is the Emma Lange, one of Lange's greatest ever aesthetic achievements. But to combine aesthetics and technology, we bring in the Zeitwerk. Launched in 2009, it immediately won the GPHG Aiguille d'Or as the most innovative watch and best overall for the 2009 year. It revolutionized public perceptions of Lange from a staid and sober Teutonic purveyor of very traditional, somewhat archaic styles to perhaps the hottest watchmaker of the late 2000s. The watch is 42 millimeters in white gold, and this is, by collector consensus, the most popular and most coveted version of the watch, short of the Lumen and the Handwerkskunst. As you can see, the time bridge on the dial side is actually part of the movement, and what appears to be a counterpart to the fixing bolt at 9 o'clock is actually a pivot for the two discs comprising the tens of minutes and the single-digit minutes. Now, it preloads the jump as the seconds hand approaches the index at 60, and then it jumps promptly when that hand reaches the index at 60. Truly impressive. Even more so, the fact that all of this is achieved without any drop in balance amplitude. Normally, charging up a jump of the minute every minute would significantly draw down the amplitude of the balance. But Lange has gotten around this by using a constant force device. This mechanism in steel has a second locking lever, and a pawl-based remontoir d'égalité. So every minute, when the minute jumps, it runs through the train, first jumping the minute, then slowing down via an aerodynamic pinwheel, and then transferring the energy to this locking lever that jumps the power to twin third wheels, between which is sandwiched a hairspring, and that hairspring is the remontoir. So that spring, and not the barrel, directly drives the balance. So whether the barrel is fully stocked or almost exhausted, and regardless of how the minute is jumping, the balance will maintain very consistent amplitude because the barrel never directly drives the balance. As you can see, we have an overcoil hairspring, chronometer style 5-position adjustment, 2 freehand engraved substructures. As you can see, across the surfaces, tons of black polishing. We have the same German silver material for the bridges, and we have a mainspring so strong that one end of it is actually anchored to the base plate of the movement. Winding a Zeitwerk is one of the great tactile pleasures in all of watchmaking. It also sounds phenomenal, and if you just want to play with the watch, it has a bidirectional setting system that allows you to pop the jump in either direction without any hazard to the watch, and remarkably for a jump hour, it also features a stop seconds function. There is a power reserve indicator for the 36-hour reserve de marche up at 12 o'clock, and though the watch is substantial, it's not oversized, and on my wrist, it wears quite comfortably. It is the Longa I dream about when I dream about Longa, and one of the Grail watches, one of the very few Grail watches that remains on my personal list. This is as good as it gets. Guys, build your own wish list. Reach out to Tim Mosso at thewatchbox.com for purchase and pricing details of any of the dream watches that you saw today. Time out, Tim out, and thanks for logging on.